Hello and welcome to what is in reality my next to last video. So this is looking at what you discussed in Unit 5 and reflecting on that, as well as looking ahead to Unit 6. There's a lot in Unit 6. So I'll try to get through it as quickly as I can. My goal is always to not make these so long. Okay, so Unit 5, statehood. A couple of comments about statehood that I thought were worth thinking about. It did not end racism, and it did not end economic inequality. And the main barrier was facing prejudice from Congress and national leaders, people in the East especially. Okay, the Mexican Revolution and Mexico and New Mexico, right? So the readings show the impact of the border on trade, labor, everyday movements, etc. And that the article by Brandon Morgan really does a good job of that. But Pancho Villa's raid influenced the national image of Columbus, New Mexico. So it's a sleepy little town that all of a sudden is in the news. And the U.S. response increased militarization along the border. Las Cuadras Blancas, protest group, with the white caps and the masks and everything, right? They were not against progress as much as the inequality in resources, land especially, and how they were taken from communal ownership and turned into private property. New owners, right? And private property is a long-standing tradition that the Europeans brought with them to the Americas. And even wins in court didn't restore the damages that were done. Spanish in schools. It was both a political and a cultural issue. It determined who could participate in government and public life. In the native boarding schools, native children were forced to learn English and punished for speaking their native languages. And that was cultural, more so than political, but for the Hispanics, it was very much both, right? Blackdom. It shows the deliberate use of law and economics to create independence. El Fuego Baca. Why was he such a hero? What did we learn from him? He was really quite the character, and he's been made that way by Hollywood even more so. But that doesn't mean that he's not a real person with real things that he did, right? Was there a change in or challenge to the perceptions of who belonged in New Mexico or in this territory? The railroads transformed New Mexico's economy, but it also deepened the divisions. And in the same way, because a lot of things have two different unintended effects, and I think I mentioned one above, but Santa Fe revival style. It helped tourism, but it led to gentrification. What else led to gentrification, though? I think that's part of a pretty complex issue. Okay, looking ahead to Unit 6, like I said. Okay, so artist colonies, rural reformers. So the growth of tourism in artist colonies like Taos and Santa Fe emphasized the economic disparity of the state. The artists wanted to portray New Mexico as a more primitive pre-industrial place. This was related to the Antiquities Act pushed by Edgar Lee Hewitt that gave the president the ability to designate sites as national monuments. At the forefront of the artist movement was Mabel Dodge Lujan, who came to to New Mexico from New York City, and she influenced other artists to come, like George O'Keeffe, but also writers and reformers. And they had this vision of New Mexico that was pretty unrealistic, but it was a very romanticized issue, perspective, right? And then we see people like Mary Austin, who wants to adopt the cultural engineering that was happening in Mexico to the schools in New Mexico. And this was, of course, post-Mexican Revolution. And so she started the San Jose Experimental School, and she trained teachers on how to teach. The Great Depression did affect New Mexico. And the fact that the idea that it didn't was overstated. Yes, New Mexico was poor before the Depression, but few New Mexicans had benefited from the boom in the 20s. But many New Mexicans were trapped in this partido arrangement that's not unlike the sharecroppers in the Southeast. And many men had become migratory laborers who raised money to pay off their debts. And with the Depression, these jobs disappeared. Dennis Chavez and the Hispanic New Deal. So Dennis Chavez, of course, is the first, born in New Mexico, elected as senator as opposed to appointed. And he was a FDR Democrat. So, when Roosevelt instituted many programs and spending initiatives to combat the economic problems, they had, created a lot of agencies. And those agencies were brought to New Mexico with varying impacts. He was largely responsible, Chavez, for the Hispanic New Deal, which was a specific subset of the New Deal program. So there was a CCC, a Civilian Conservation Corps, a WPA, or Works Progress Administration, and there were women's work programs like the county home, demonstration agents that helped women modernize their practices in the kitchen, in the home, etc. The Indian New Deal. So John Collier was the architect of what we call the Indian New Deal. And the Indian Reorganization Act had reverse policies on native land ownership and political rights, terminated the requirement for boarding schools. Native tribes could create their own governments, their own constitutions. And these all followed with the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. But they also had these negative impacts, like they thought that the stock, that the sheep and the mustangs, the horses, were instrumental in creating the Dust Bowl. So they wanted to remove them. They wanted to reduce the stocks. And this has been a blot on Collier's record. Even though he did a lot to support the natives, this one was a really bad one, right? And it did not improve the erosion at all. It caused damage on the economy, and it was harmful to the culture of the Navajo people. And then we get to World War II, which is probably the most famous, right? So we know already that we had, so let me just start out by saying spending on the World War, the Second World War, and things like the Manhattan Project and stuff like that brought an end to the Great Depression. All of these other programs helped, but they did not bring it to an end. The New Deal had initiated increased federal intervention in New Mexico and the West in general. Okay, the war touched New Mexico in many ways. One, the Japanese-American internment camps. So we had a few here in Santa Fe, the most important ones being in New Mexico, the most important ones being near Santa Fe, and one down in Lordsburg, which also housed Italian and German, prisoners of war or people that were suspected of disloyalty. The Bataan Death March. There were 1,800 New Mexicans that were sent with the 111th National Guard to the Philippines. They were attacked by the Japanese, forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, where they were they surrendered and were forced to march 60 miles, treated very badly, about 10,000, and along with Filipinos who lived there and Filipinos who were fighting. I mean, it wasn't just them, but about 10,000 men were killed or died on the march. A third of those rescued died of complications, and about half of the 1,800 New Mexicans died at the time. The Navajo Code Talkers. So one of these ironic things where they used the Navajo language that they were trying to obliterate. Okay, just thought I would add that. Anyway, so the Navajos created an unbreakable code, and it was not recognized until about 25 years later because the military thought maybe they would have to use it again. And then, of course, the Manhattan Project. New Mexico's isolation was part of the appeal. Los Alamos was actually one of 3 different locations that were working on various aspects of the project. It was decentralized on purpose. So Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, J. Robert Oppenheimer was the person that was overseeing the scientific aspects of the project, but it fell under military control, under the Army Corps of Engineers and under a man named General Leslie Groves. Los Alamos ended up housing over 6,500 people, but even then it didn't appear on any maps until after the war. It was given the designation of site-wide. And the bomb was tested, we know, also in New Mexico at the Alamogordo bombing range, now White Sands Missile Range. Harry Truman had just become president in April, and he had to decide when to hold the test as well as whether or not to use the bomb. And so he wanted to time the test, to correspond with the Potsdam Conference. Okay. And it was, of course, very dramatic. Nobody was told anything about it. And then 3 weeks later, the first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. And population 320,000, 70 to 80,000 died instantly, another 100,000 over the next few years. 3 days later, it dropped another one on the city of Nagasaki, which was slightly smaller, 260,000, but the casualties were even more extensive because it was a different kind of bomb. So one was hydrogen, one was plutonium. Think about the impact on local communities. Los Alamos is a wealthy, highly educated white county surrounded by poor, non-white rural counties. The lands that were taken were taken without any approval by the Pueblos. They were just taken. Local people were employed at site-wide, but they worked as maids, janitors, and technicians. The surrounding areas are very highly contaminated, including several of the Pueblos. And then we get to the civil rights. So just like post-war United States, post-war New Mexico participated in the civil rights movements, but they were perhaps a little bit specific. So the Alianza de Mercedes Libres, which was headed by Reyes Lopez Tijerina, and he dealt with issues about land grants. And he had some, you'll read about, maybe even see a video, I think, about the, his shootout at the, at the Rio Arriba County Courthouse, okay? And he ends up eventually getting arrested. And then when he was released, he spent a lot of time in Mexico and back and forth. But there were also Chicano community organizations, and there were cooperatives formed to help small landowners and other people. So eventually we get, in addition to Alianza, the La Raza Unida Party. African American rights. Now we know that there are way fewer African Americans here, but that doesn't mean they weren't doing anything and they weren't participating, right? So they were spread out, and it made getting a unified front a little bit more difficult. And not all of the schools were segregated, in part because there just weren't enough students and it was too costly to build separate schools, right? But they were segregated within the schools. Sorry, getting a tickle. The first black student at UNM entered in 1921. By the late 1940s, we began to see formations of NAACP chapters and stuff like that. And then finally, indigenous people civil rights. Most of the New Mexico's Native Americans did not participate in the more militant things, like the Red Power movement, but they were active. And so in the 1920s, the Pueblo peoples had reestablished the All-Indian Pueblo Council to defend their lands and to access resources. And the Mescalero Apache people, remember them from back in Bosque Redondo, right? Under the leadership of Wendell Chino, who was their president for a long time, were early adopters of gaming and tourism in order to boost their economies and to promote self-determination. And he very much fought the government when they told him that he couldn't do something. Then the last chapter very briefly addresses topics relevant to the turn of the century, like the lowrider culture, movements to publicize Native American rights and histories in New Mexico, those sort of things. So that's what we have. I'm sorry, it went too long. But anyway, it's the last one. And you've all done great. Congratulations. And let me know if you have questions.